All right, hello, and welcome to another conlang with me. This is the first one in quite some time. And today, I wanted to share a conlang project I've been working on for some time, a few months now, and also work a little bit more on it. This language, I've called it a couple things right now. I've landed on madun or madun. There's some variable pronunciation there with the letter D. I think I tend to pronounce it madun, but I'm going to talk about how this language is working so far, and then I'm going to try to work on some new aspects of it that I'm still figuring out. I am not going to do too much of that today just because of time, but I am going to do some working on the language today. So, how does madun work? What is it for? What does it do? Madun is set. Oh, I just realized my stream has the wrong label right now. My stream probably said something like yesterlore. That I meant to change that. It should say conlang with me today, but it does not. I'm not going to try to fix that right now because that would require me to open Twitch, and my laptop will not be happy with that while running OBS. So we'll just have to deal with that. So how does this language work? I'm still not completely decided on all the aspects of how it works, but generally it is an isolating language with some affixes for grammatical purposes that I will talk about shortly. But I think I'm going to start with the goals. That's always a good place to start. They're kind of nebulous still, but the idea is to treat all things as spiritually equal and as participating or eschewing relations of reciprocity with other things. I definitely need to update this directory because I have more tabs there than I used to. The second goal is use grammar to clarify and emphasize the relationships between things, and then words should be phonetically pleasing in different contexts and grammatical transformations. So the goals have shifted a little bit since then, but that's the vague idea of treating things as in relationship with each other. That doesn't mean there can't be any sort of hierarchy of information or of entities, but the idea is a bit more sort of like treating sentences like they're an environment, or like it's almost like the sentence is an ecology rather than complete. I guess there is subordination, but the sentence is about the relationships between things, and each sentence will have a different emphasis about which thing it wants to focus on, which isn't too different from how most languages work. I just wanted to think more about this, especially in the creation of words. So let's talk about how I create words. First, I'll just show you the phonology here. Not a ton of phonemes. And there is some allophony. You'll see some things instead of an arrow for transformations that happen. Actually, this should also be a tilde here. I'm using a tilde for like there's variation. I don't have a lot of strict ones. I should change this to just the letter N though, because M will stay separate and not assimilate to place. This is just talking about assimilation of the nasal to the place of what comes after it. Really, that's just that N has an allophone ng, eng, or agma that will come before these phonemes, or mostly these two. Sometimes this one, but again, it's a little loose. I'm meant to be very loose with the phonology on purpose. because I just wanted to be able to pronounce things differently depending on how I was feeling that day. One of the ones that I typically do, though, is I will intervocalically fricate these sounds, and I will palatalize these three sounds before the letter I, before the vowel E. We've got 5 vowels: E, E, A, O, U, and E and U can also be semi-vowels, W and Y, usually before another vowel, but they do not have to be parsed that way, and you can separate them out. There's no prosody that's been fixed yet. I don't know if there's even going to be. So if you wanted to do like a more timed thing, then these would pretty much, you could treat these as just vowels. You could also not treat them as vowels and still have more timing. I'm mostly doing a syllable timing thing, I think, but I'm probably not going to be consistent with that, and I'm okay with that. That's not really the goal. The goal is for it to sound nice depending on how I feel like pronouncing it. So I don't know if I will go back and define a prosody. Anything like stress or tone or pitch or anything like that. I'm not incorporating that into the language. There are some phonotactic constraints. I'm using capital letters here to sort of abbreviate some of these categories as shorthand for my phonotactics here. So these are like the allowable word initial sort of like consonant situations. You don't have to have a consonant at the beginning, but if you do, it could be just a straight up consonant, or it can be any of these two combinations. In the middle of a word, you can have a 2 consonant cluster, but that is the limit. You can't have more than 2 consonants. And then at the end of a word, you can either end with a resonant, or you can end with a resonant followed by a coronal obstruent. Those are the rules. Them's the rules. So that also means if you have an M, for example, it's going to go to N in that case. So that is something that does happen. That is an example of an M changing place. But that's only at the end of a word. So I guess I could put that in. But that only happens, these situations will only happen. There are no words that have these clusters at the end. These clusters are meant to allow for, I should put that you can end a word with a single S as well. You have a resonant or S, or you can have a resonant followed by S. Actually, no, I don't think you can. I'll double check. These come in with some noun. Yeah, it can't be a resonant plus S. That was my bad. Noun suffixes, word final noun suffixes. So it's actually a resonant plus a coronal stop / voiced fricative. So these two. And what these really are actually variants of S allomorphically. And we'll see that when I get to the nouns. So that is the sound system. What I'm going to talk about next is I think I'll do the words themselves, actually, and then we'll talk about how to modify them, because that's sort of the order that I figured this out in. So that's what we're going to do. So here is my lexicon page, and you'll see I have different kinds of words. Right now the kinds are in reverse alphabetical order. That's not the best order. I was just trying to decide to put them in. Before it was in the order that I made them. So I'm keeping track of the number, like which number word is it, like in terms of when I made it. Oh, this got messed up here. The sizing of this one. Let's make this row thicker. Should that work? No, that's even worse. Sorry, it's from Manchu, so it has a vertical script, and that's making it cut off the word a bit. There we go. For the root. So I'll explain my structure here, and then I'll explain how these words come about. So I have different categories. I'll talk about those in a bit, but I want to talk about my columns here. This is just how I'm organizing my dictionary. And the reason I want to do this is sort of the point of this conlang with me series is just to give you guys ideas, if you ever want to make a conlang, ideas for how you can go about things. So I have my word. In the language, I have a category. You'll notice these aren't exactly grammatical. There are some things like particle that you'll see. You'll also see affix. But for the most part, they're like the type of word it is semantically. And that's on purpose. And I'll explain that in a bit. That's mostly to help me. And I think I'm going to color code the kinds later. But I haven't done that yet. Then I have a sort of like label emoji. That's just to keep track of when a word has multiple possible translations or definitions. I just kind of separate out the different definitions with the emoji just because it's appealing and fun. And also if there's words that use the same emoji because they're like semantically similar, I could also potentially reorder the dictionary based on the emoji, and that could like group words that have similarities even though they're different kinds, for example. It's just mostly just a fun visual thing. Another thing I do is gloss it. So if I were to write glossing of a sentence, I want a label for each word. And some of them are like I just made up a word, or it's just a easily choosable word here. But it's just like the official dictionary gloss of the word, because a lot of these words have a lot of possible translations. Then I have the spring. Basically, it's where the word comes from. And this language is a posteriori in its vocabulary and a priori in its grammar. The grammar is the part that I'm just kind of coming up with wholesale with some influences, but I'm not copying any one language's exact grammar because this language is going to be very unique in terms of how it works. But I do have a set of like donors, and I'll show that when we get to the word creation sheet. But what I have is the language and what the word is in the language, and then a gloss of the word's original meaning in the original language that it comes from. Some of them have notes. Like, for example, this word for intrusive igneous rocks comes from an Egyptian word, ancient Egyptian name for the city of Aswan. And the reason for that is it was the site of a major granite quarry. And then it became the Arabic word for granite. So that's why I chose it for this word, because granite is a type of intrusive igneous. I'll explain that more, like that process, in a little bit. So I have a bunch of different donors, and I'll explain the donors. And then I have what the word is in the original language. And then I have the gloss. And then I just keep track of which one it is, which number it is on the side, so that I can reorder it in the creation order if I want. And what you'll see is the word in the original language gets put into the phonology of my language. You can't necessarily see that with some of these because some of these use different scripts. But if we go with a easier to read script, like for example, this Basque word, I believe that's P. I'm forgetting which one is Z and which one is S. Basque has two S sounds, and they write one with Z and one with S, and I can't remember which one is which. But it has to do with the tongue placement when you say the letter S. Like if it's apical or laminal. Can't remember if Z is apical or laminal. But in either case, that Z sound just gets turned into my language's S. And it means fragment. And I use that for foliated metamorphic rock. So that gets put in. Another example is here. Let's do the Old Norse word ro, which is calm or peace. I'm using that as a particle for the oblique case, which I'll explain later. And I'm just making it ro. So it doesn't maintain the length. In some words, I am maintaining length. It's really just depending on what kind of word it is, and also kind of the vibe of how important I think the length is in the word, in the original word. I'm treating different languages differently with regards to length, I think. But the other piece of this is that this is a particle, and I want it to be short because I just wanted the oblique case particle to be short. So even if I were to keep the length, I would probably get rid of it because it's a particle. So those are my columns. That's how that works. That's how I'm taking a language. Oh, here's an example where length is getting maintained. So this Japanese word, koomori, I'm actually rendering long o as o in my language. That's how it gets written in hiragana anyway. So I just bring that in, even though it's not o in Japanese. That's what it is in the language. That's just how it like renders Japanese long central vowels. I think that's what happens with long a. It's written a, and then I actually borrow it as a. Just because I just like the feel of it better than a double o, in this language at least. So that is how I am transferring words into the language. In terms of the sound, you'll notice in Hawaiian here there's a long a for the word for charcoal, and I'm not maintaining the long a here. All right, so I'm going to explain a little bit about the categories now. And I guess I can start with rock. I just wanted the different main kinds of rocks to each have a way to refer to it. Because just to be able to talk about different kinds of rock. And the idea of this is when you're referring to like the location that you're at, or like the physical context, you're like encouraged to be more mindful of what kind of rock you're on. Notice these aren't specific minerals. There are some mineral words that I have, and I might add more, but these are just the type of rock that it is. Vaguely, these are like very vague categories. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 rock categories here. I also only have 2 process words now. This is the category of word I think I need to make the most of still, or it's just something I'm sorely in need of because it's something I need to make more sentences. And right now I only have heat and cold. But you'll notice I'm glossing them as hot and cold, but they have multiple meanings. So it's just generally adding energy. It can also mean to melt a solid, vaporize a liquid, or ionize gas. And then you see like this is the opposite of that, removing energy, cold. So these are like changes of state or alterations of state. And these are the only process nouns I have. I'm going to add more. I probably shouldn't say noun because all of these words can, with the exception of particles and affixes, can be nouns or verbs, really, depending on what you do to them and how you use them. And that's something I'll explain when we get to the inflection. So those are my rock nouns. I have process nouns. These are particles I'll talk about later. I only have 1 occupation noun. And I can't really explain why I have this. It's just a word I wanted in the language, and I realized I wanted it. I'll probably have more occupations later, but I've mostly been focusing on more general environmental vocabulary rather than specific like human social vocabulary, and that's something I'm going to add more of later. Now, this next category, this is the one that you're actually encouraged to use the most when you're talking about like entities in a sentence. And these are I'm just calling these niches. They're not technically like specific niches just because every species has a niche. But what you're really doing here is talking about like the sort of role in the environment that your noun is taking when you're using these as nouns. These all can also function as verbs that indicate that like whatever other nouns you have in the sentence, your agent, if you have agent focus, which is the default, which I'll talk about later, is doing acting as this niche. So there are, I think, 13 that I have here. So that's not a lot of distinction. I might be able to add more, but I specifically wanted 12, and then I wanted the 13th one, to be a pathogen, parasite, pest. This is the 13th one. It's just ordered differently because of the alphabetization of the categories I did here. But these are the niches, and you can kind of see how they go. And what I've done is also given examples of different species filling those niches. One critique that I have of my own system here is I don't want to add more niches necessarily. Maybe I will down the line decide that I want to add more niches. I just really like having a small number, because one of the other goals that I guess I didn't talk about on the goal page is I don't want there to be a huge number of words in this. I want it to be reasonably minimalistic. And it's just more about a philosophical change in perspective and how you construct sentences. Kind of like what Tokipona does with its small number of words. Definitely not as small as Tokipona. I definitely want more than Tokipona. And I think I already do have more than Tokipona. But more in the sense of the restricted vocabulary forcing you to change your philosophical approach to expressing ideas. That's sort of where I'm going with the language, and that's why I wanted a smaller number of words. So I'm trying to have some kind of cap on most of my categories, but I did really like the idea of 12 niches and then the 13th being pathogen or parasite, because that just kind of feels funny when we think about the superstitions about the number 13. I don't know. 12 feels like a nice round number, and then 13 is the addition that is I guess auspicious isn't, I guess auspicious can be the word in the negative sense, additional niche. And again, the niches, the labels are not necessarily correlated with all of the meanings of a word, but they're just supposed to be like a tag to tell me what word it is that I'm using. So if I search pathogen, it doesn't have to be a pathogen. It can be any kind of pest in the context. And this could even be used for individual people. You could use this word to talk about a person who's being a pest. And that's one of the other things about the vocabulary of this language that I wanted, is that you're not tied to identifying our expressions, which is what these are, things that are functioning as nouns that refer to a type of thing. They don't have to be tied to these specific things, durin, for example, here does not have to mean monkey, and a monkey does not have to be a durin. It's just when the monkey is acting as a durin in the context of the sentence that you use it. That's sort of the approach. So these, again, are just supposed to be examples here. The italicized words are meant to be examples of of words that you might typically use this niche word to express in the context where that is applicable. So if you could have a person here that's acting as a decomposer, detrivore, or scavenger, right? I'm just calling them recyclers, again, as just a tag. But I could use this word sapro for a person. I could use it for a lot of things depending on what's doing that. And this could also be, like I said, it could be a verb to do this, to act as this niche. Or it could be a noun doing something else, something that's doing this, doing something else that's in the verb. I'm coming through quietly. Oh no. Let me fix that. Thank you, Crafting Entropy. Let me fix that. All right. Hello, is this better? Let me know if this is better. Thank you for the heads up. Much better. Yay. Okay. Yeah, I just had to drag up the thing, my mic. I also moved my mic closer to me now. Thank you so much. All right. So that's how I'm approaching my niches. Now, what I also have are some mineral words. Some of these mineral words are also doubling as planets. This is just an alchemy thing that fits very nicely in my brain. But I have a few different kinds of mineral words. Most of the mineral words that I have are ones that are important for like biology, or ones that are salient in my biology at least. But a lot of them are also planet words because because alchemy, because that's fun. This is also meant to be fun. But I have some more minerals. Most of them, like you see, are like zinc, potassium, iodine, magnesium, manganese, etc. And then I have some general matter ones. I have 5 of these. They're the 5 classical elements, basically. And they're also very vague in terms of their meaning here, and can be used in a lot of different ways. Then we get into life forms, and this is kind of where I went very silly. You are not usually encouraged to use specific life form vocabulary unless you need it to disambiguate. That was sort of one of the things I wanted in my approach. Like when you're talking about a creature in a sentence, you're very encouraged to use the niche that it's fulfilling in the context. I might also say, if we're talking about people, I definitely want more occupation nouns, and I might also add some like other kinds of role nouns for like role in a context. That would, I guess, kind of be in that same occupation sense, that will kind of function like the niches when we're talking about other humans and other living things. But I do have life form words, and I decided to be very silly with how I broke these up. It's kind of like, basically it's like tree of life, but I've used the scissors in very arbitrary places where I thought would be funny for myself. So you can kind of see here, this is like most birds, most kinds of birds. But then if we scroll down a bit, oh boy, this being alphabetized is actually pretty tricky. We also see some other birds, all other dinosaurs, and all other archosaurs are in a different word. Because I thought that would be funny. What we also see here is an example of one, I think I only have a couple words like this, where I couldn't decide on one word for the thing. So I just have entirely like synonyms, like complete synonyms that have no nuance to difference, that you could just use one or the other for the same set of species. And this kind of goes throughout. I've very much just cut plants and animals and other creatures into very arbitrary groups, and some aren't even actually monophyletic, like worms. There are so many different orders of beings. Order's probably not the right word. I'm not a biologist. But so many different things that could be called worms that aren't even in the same branch of the tree of life, but I'm just calling them worms. I just basically chose what I thought would be the most funny and fun for me to use. One of my favorites is that Uracontins and Glarus are one word. Like all of these species. If you want to refer to them, you use the same word. So like humans and mice are both, you just use the word for mouse. And you see like this word that has exact synonyms. It's a lot of different mammals, but you also have other groups of mammals. It's pretty arbitrary. It was more like I had a kind of like with the niches. Robert Burns approves. Oh gosh, I lost what I was going to say about this. I completely lost my train of thought. Oh no. Let's roll back a bit. I again wanted. I had a specific number of words that I wanted to allow myself for like different. What's the word? Kingdoms. So I wanted only a certain number of plant words, a certain number of like tetrapod words, a certain number of non-plant, non-animal words. And I kind of limited myself to that. And then within that, I just kind of grouped. How I did this, I don't have the evidence here anymore because I got rid of that sheet. But I basically like broke the tree of life into different cells on this sheets document. I broke them all into different cells and different families. And then I came up with how many I wanted in each sort of vague category that I made up. And then I sort of just merged cells of the ones that I thought would be the most funny and fun to use to make it fit that number that I wanted. And the other part of this, part of the goal of making them kind of silly and not entirely intuitive, I want these to kind of become intuitive because I think that would be really funny if my brain did that. But I want to really discourage the use of like, I need to say what species this is very specifically. I want these only really used either to be funny or if you just really want to say the kind of animal it is, you're stuck being vague in a Tokipona kind of way, but in a kind of way that you can't really get around the awkwardness of. And to encourage you to use the niche words instead, which are even more vague and not tied to a species or group of species here. I think one of my favorites is that all fungi are one word, and they can fit so many different niches, and that's important. So like this word is almost useless. Plant is also, I have a word for plant, but it's also not the most useful because usually a plant is going to be an autotroph, so you could just use the word for autotroph in most cases, although not there will be exceptions to those things, but I have a word. So those are the life form words, and they were where I got the silliest, I think. I also have a few element words, and this is basically just me like taking columns of the periodic table. If kind of like actually, this doesn't analogize as well as the life form thing does. Also, dragon, shout out to dragons that I included. And I literally actually define this as dragon as the gloss for lepidosaurs. And dragons go there. I know not all dragons look like lepidosaurs. Some are more avian. Just use avian then, or one of the two avians. You can call it a dinosaur or archosaur, or you can call it a neoaves. Whichever one fits your dragon more, or a worm, which is etymologically related to this word. If I write just Germanic or Celtic, I mean proto. Insert word proto there. But I have basically chopped the periodic table into columns that I have words for. I doubt I'm going to use these a lot. I'm not the best at chemistry, but I just wanted them to exist in case you needed them. My glosses are once again very alchemy pilled here. Cool earths, stones, life earths, hot earths, salts, and vapors. Just because I thought that would be fun. And then I have biomolecules grouped in a very also kind of silly way. What I kind of vaguely did was group them by what they impact, which biochemistry is very complicated, and this is very simplified. And I also gave them very silly titles. But I very, very vaguely grouped what different kinds of vitamins and other biomolecules do in the body into very vague categories of what they can be involved with, and then I grouped them together into these words. These, I guess what I call them, words. Yeah, these are words. With these glosses. So we have a few hormone words. I'm calling them humors again, because I think that's funny. Different kinds of, like, I have lipids. I have some other ones. Where? Oh, yeah, there's soluble fiber. So that is how my biomolecules work. I haven't made words for organs yet, but I probably will have words for organs. And I might want to match those up with like processes when I make more process words. And then I also have biome words, and I have, I think, 12 biome words that I allowed myself to have, which means some of these are very vague, and some environments won't fit neatly into these. You might need to split where you are into categories here, or just go with the closest one. But I have biome words, and these are heavily encouraged to exist somewhere in your sentence. You don't have to. I didn't want it to be where you were required to use one of 12 words in every sentence, but it is encouraged, again, to include this somewhere to give context for what you're talking about. I might add, not biome, but other like sort of locational words, but I think I would rather have you use, I don't know, occupation or other kind of things to talk about that, and then use the dative focus, which I'll talk about when we get to grammar in a bit. But yeah, so I have some different biome words. I only have 2 artifact words. One is writing, but it also refers to any kind of meta commentary or representation. I'm just calling it writing. And then that's an old word. It's madun. The name of the language it used to be madunata, but it was too long. Basically, it's from the ancient Egyptian word for hieroglyphics, but I added the first person plural possessive n to it, and I also like got rid of the sacred part because, I don't know, feels weird to include that in the name of this language. That's the hiero part of the hieroglyphs. I'm just calling it like our language, madun, here, and that's that. And then I have some affixes here. I'll talk about those on the affix pages when we go into grammar. Before we do that, though, I do want to talk about my process for making words, and that is on this axe sheet here. I don't know if you can see the axe, but I have an axe here, and this looks very similar to the other page, except that it's wider. It has a lot more columns, and it has these little check boxes. Again, I'm going to try to explain this in case it's something you want to implement in your own work. And this elements of this process are highly inspired by one of my friends, whose Twitch channel you should check out. I will actually probably link it in the description. She does kind of like chill gaming streams, very different type of content to what I'm doing, but she kind of taught me this method of like word creation and then movement to another sheet. And it's one we've done on some of our collaborative conlangs, so gotta give her a shout out. Komolana is the channel there. So yeah, I'll put that in the description of the YouTube upload of this VOD. So what's different here is that for spring, I have gloss, but then I have, instead of tongue and the actual root word, I have a bunch of categories. And my categories are, I decided on different categories of donor word that I wanted to typically go to. So Germanic, Celtic, Romance, Greek, other, and then any other Indo-European language that isn't one of those categories, which I do have quite a few words from other Indo-European languages or just straight up Proto-Indo-European that I can take from, and that goes in this category. I also have Ancient Egyptian. This could be Ancient Egyptian or it could be Coptic, depending on which sound I like the best of the word. And then any Semitic language. I've been mostly taking from Arabic and Hebrew, but I think I have a Phoenician word and an Aramaic word. I'll need to double check, but and I think I have an Akkadian word in there too. Although that might have just been an idea and I didn't go with it. Then I have Japanese. Any Austronesian language. This wasn't a category before, but I kept taking from either Hawaiian or Tagalog, or I think I have at least one Maori word in here. And then this is another one that wasn't originally a category, but I kept including a couple. I included a couple, and I was like, I might as well make that a category, Lashute Seed, as a donor language. And then miscellaneous will be any other language in the world that I want to borrow from. I will usually use like the earth emoji that includes the part of the world that the language comes from, and then I'll just write the name of the language there. And then any Eldarin language. So usually it's Quenya that I'm taking from. If I take from Sindarin, I take from Sindarin. But yeah, mostly Quenya is what I'm using there. And so what I'll do is if I have my concept, I'll start with like the meanings that I want it to have. Well, I'll usually start with the category actually, and then I'll start with the meanings that I want. And you'll see I have, actually you might not see it because I've cut it off, but I've hidden all of the rows. This is row 123 because I've hidden all the prior rows of words I've finished. But I'll explain my process a little bit. So let's say I come up with a meaning. What I'll do is I'll think about like what different words that fit into the category of this meaning do I know of in different languages, or if I can't think of any, I'll look them up. And I'll basically just put a lot of different options here and go with the one that I think sounds the nicest when I bring it into the phonology of this language. So for example, there might be a word in one of these languages that sounds really nice in the language, but it might kind of not sound as nice once I put it into my smaller phonology. So that's sort of how I come up with words. I don't want to open all these because I can't open just one. It will open all 120-ish rows that are hidden right now. But then what I do, once I've chosen a word, I've decided on the word, like which one I want it to be. I'll also bold which column it comes from, or like the specific word in the original language that it is, just to make it easier for myself when I'm filling it in on the other page. And then I'll put this check mark to show that I've decided on the word, and then I'll go down. And then once I've put it, this little arrow here, once I've put it onto the dictionary sheet, then I'll click this to show, and this will bold this word, to show that it's in the other dictionary, and I can safely then like close, I can like hide this row later. I'm not going to do this though, because I don't have a word there. So that's a process I do, and then there's just some conditional formatting that tells this column to bold when this is checked. If you want to use colors, you can. If you want to like change the color when you've checked something, you can. That I just used bolding because I'm not the best at conditional formatting. But that is how this sheet works. That's how I come up with words. And I'll explain a little bit more about my choices there. So how do I choose a word for a whole vague category like this? It's kind of arbitrary. Again, I go with what sounds the nicest, and sometimes I go with humor as well because that'll help me remember the word. So for example, this word for, I want it to slow down. Okay, zinc, for example, I take it from Japanese, and it's from this Japanese word for zinc. So that's pretty straightforward. But let's go to something that's a bigger category, like phobids. There are so many different species in here of plants. Many important foods are in this category, for example, and they're all one word, and they're from this Farsi word, this Persian word, which we'll see over here. It's gul, and it's an archaic word for rose, but it could also refer to the core of a watermelon. And the reason I chose that is because rosids are in this, or phobids are a kind of rosid, and rosalis is part of the phobid subbranch of rosids. And so are watermelon, because gourds are a different type of phobid. And this word was fun because it archaically means rose, but can also mean the core of a watermelon. And I was like, well, that's kind of great because that actually covers two of these sub ones. But not all of them are so neat like that. For example, I went with the Phoenician word for camel for this entire category that I'm calling swine, which is any kind of swine or ruminant or cetacean or hippo or camelid. I just chose the word that I liked the best. So on this sheet, which again, I'm not going to reopen all those rows because that will slow down my computer immensely. I had a bunch of different words for different animals in this life form category, and I just chose the one that I liked the sound of the best, and gamal was my favorite one of those, and so that's the one I went with. So that's sort of my process for making the life form words pretty arbitrary. There are some words that have a dual etymology in the sense that they could come from multiple different languages and still fit the category. So like, for example, for archosaur, I took the word that means cassowary in Tolai, but it means ghost or spirit in Wewurung. I don't think I'm pronouncing that correctly. Wewurung. I think that's a retroflex R. Wurung. So Tolai is spoken in Papua New Guinea, I think, and then Wewurung is spoken in, I think, Australia, Southern Australia. But I liked that it also meant ghost or spirit because this refers to dinosaurs. I thought that was kind of poetic. That it also, I think it actually is related to the meaning of cassowary. Maybe that's an aerial thing. I don't think these languages are related. Like they're not in the same family at all, because Tolai is Austronesian, whereas Wewurung is an Australian language that I don't even know if is it part of a larger family, or if it is, we're not sure about the what's the word? Taxonomy of the language. But potentially, I just liked the sound. And one change you'll see is that they're murup in these languages, but I put a double U here because P cannot end a word. And I'm going with two strategies when that happens. Either I add an echo vowel, or, so this could have been murupu, or for certain sounds, like if it's a labial sound, I'll just go with the labial vowel there, because this can also kind of function as a W if you want it to, so it could be like muru, and that's a labial consonant. So again, pretty arbitrary. Here's another word that has just complete synonyms. I liked the Palestinian Aramaic word for cedar, and I also liked the Lishitsi word for Douglas fir. So I included both because they're both really nice sounding. Sabida and Arsa are how they end up being pronounced in the phonology of this language. Here's an example of one that isn't one of my main donors, Swahili. I have a word for Swahili from Swahili. It's the word for elephant shrew, which I thought was fun because it is one of the groups in this group. That was kind of redundant, but another split etymology, this word for the malvids. This word means mustard plant These are actually etymologically related, the Gothic word and the Egyptian word, because the Gothic is loaned from the Greek, which is loaned from the Egyptian word for mustard plant. So that's my process. With these, again, I just kind of chose pretty arbitrary words. Honestly, for the biomolecules, this is where things got very arbitrary. Some of them are just a food or plant that or animal that has that biomolecule. Like, for example, bean or legume is the soluble fiber word. So that is my process. Let me talk about grammar a little bit. So like I said earlier, every word can be a verb or a noun. And then for adjectives, you kind of mess with noun relations a bit. So for verbs, this language currently has a symmetrical voice system. Very rudimentary one, very like small number of voices. But if you're not familiar with symmetrical voice, it's a feature that many Austronesian languages have. It's sometimes called Austronesian alignment or a trigger system. There's debate about all of those terminologies. I'm just using the term symmetrical voice because I think it captures pretty well what's going on. I'll explain it a little bit. So in an accusative language like English, you often have an active voice and a passive voice. And an active voice sentence with an active verb, I'll go active and passive. What you end up with is you have an active verb that identifies the subject of the verb as usually the agent. There are some exceptions, but usually it's the doer of the verb. There are some things called ergative verbs where that's not the case, but most accusative verbs in accusative languages like English will do that. And really you're talking about something doing the verb. So doer does verbs, and then you also might have an object. But that depends on the verb. Some verbs are intransitive and then don't have objects. And ergative verbs, which almost behave like the language is ergative, are where a verb is transitive, a transitive verb goes doer, verb, verb's object. But the intransitive actually identifies the subject as the patient, the one who the verb is done to. So an example would be like melt. When it's transitive, someone melts the ice, but then you say the ice melts, and in the intransitive there, even though you're in the active voice, you're not using a passive, it kind of has a passive meaning because the ice is the thing being melted rather than the melter. So a passive in an accusative language basically removes the doer and puts what was the object into the subject position. So it's like object, which is now the subject. So it's like subject is verbed, right? So that's what we do. And then if you want to talk about the doer, you need some kind of extra thing, usually a preposition like by, like the subject is verbed by so-and-so or such and such. So the subject, I'm just using English word order here. I'm going subject, verb, object because that's what English does, but the order isn't what matters. It's sort of like the role here. The subject, and then we have the object. I guess I should call this patient. If I can spell. And then I have agent is verbed. Patient is verbed. Now, that is active and passive voice. When you have symmetrical voice, what that really just means is that you have voices that can subjectize, I guess, additional things besides agent and patient, because there are other semantic rules that exist in accusative languages, for example, but they usually use things like prepositions to get them across. And languages that have symmetrical voice can have a lot of voices. I only have 4, so I really only add 2 more voices. The active and passive I'm calling agentive and patientive, because an active voice lets the agent be the subject, and a patient voice lets the patient be the subject. So that's basically how this works. So it's agentive by default in this language. So if you just use a word like the verb, you're basically saying that the agent is the one doing that, is the subject. And the word order I'm currently using is VSO right now. So the verb is going to be the first word in the sentence. I might have some ways to not do that. I might have a particle or something that lets you get around that, but that's the main word order. I should probably write that here, VSO. And then it's also head modifier in general order, head modifier. So dative and vialis are very vague, but what I'm basically doing is grouping a lot of other kinds of semantic rules together. So the dative, I'm basically grouping what other languages usually have a locative voice for, a recipient voice for. The languages will tend to have one or the other, or some have both, but I'm just grouping both into dative. And then there's also what I'm calling vialis, is like instrument voice in many languages, and also like reason/cause are also going to go into the vialis. Sort of like how and why is the subject. Here it's like for whom or for what, or to whom or to what, or where is the subject. So how this is hard to translate into English because English doesn't have these voices. But if I were to approximate it, like this could be like location is verbed at, or you can have like recipient is verbed to or for. So if you had, say, like a ditransitive verb in a typical accusative language like give, in agent voice, you would have like agent verbs, like agent gives patient, like the thing, to the recipient. So you might need a preposition to indicate the dative, right? And in this language, you'd use the oblique here. So you'd have like, in this language's order, you'd have like the verb, which is giving or something like that. And then you'd have the giver, and then you'd have the recipient, the thing that you're giving. And then you'll have an oblique particle, and then you'll have the recipient. But if you use the dative voice, then you'd have the verb, then the recipient, and then you'd use an indirect for either the giver or the gift, depending on what you want to say there. And I'll explain this whole thing. This is something that specifically Tagalog and some other Philippine languages do, where they merge the ergative and accusative, cases that many other languages do. The ergative would be for the agent and the accusative for the patient. But I just use one for both. So I'm calling it indirect because that's what many linguists do when they're describing Tagalog, because the direct is basically the case that the subject is in. And for that, I actually don't have a particle, which is not common in languages that have symmetrical voice, but it's something that I'm doing because it's just whatever comes after the verb that is not a modifier, and there's a way to tell, will be the direct case, which will be whatever the subject is that the voice will indicate. So if there's no kind of voice marking, then you know that the thing that comes after the verb that isn't a modifier is the agent. And then if there is some kind of inflection, then it is one of these other things. So here it's again like instrument or cause here is verbed with, and then is verbed because of. I'm just putting BCOF there. So it's just a different way to talk about what you're. It's basically just a way to emphasize different things, whereas English will often just either use passive or topic movement. Like we'll sometimes put things at the beginning of the sentence before the subject to emphasize it, because we're kind of limited to having an active or passive voice, right? So you basically just have more options for what you're emphasizing. And one thing that I've done in a few of my examples is example sentences, which I haven't put on here yet, is I like to use the dative voice and then have the biome be the subject. So you'd have like whatever your verb is, and then you'd say is verbed at or in, and then you have the biome as the subject. So I'll actually go ahead and give an example. You can actually see some example, this shouldn't be italicized, I just realized, some examples of words getting marked for different voices here. And this kind of talks about, the point of this is to show what happens with different types of words. So sometimes you have words that begin with a vowel, for example, and there you put an epenthetic H after the prefix. And I'll explain these subscripts a little bit here. Some of these use reduplication. So the patientive reduplicates the first consonant vowel pair, or the first vowel and then puts H if it just begins with a vowel and there's no consonant. So you see that happening with ehear here. So ear is like, that means like to, whatever watering would be in context. Something is watering, something else potentially, or just something is watering, because that's the verb is going to, the subject is going to be the doer. So you'd have ear and then the person who waters. But if something is water, then you'd say eher, like if they are being watered. If it is water, it's receiving the action that is water. I can't think of an example sentence where this makes sense yet, but there probably is. If water is where something is happening, or what something is happening for, then you infix an M or a homorganic nasal. So, I might need to change that on my phonology. M does assimilate if there's a plosive. It just won't assimilate if there's a resonant. I should put that in my rule. So like, for example, if you have an L here, it will say ML, it won't become NL, but because this is a plosive, it's going to assimilate. It won't be MK, it'll be NK. I should write that somewhere. But the actual infix is me or just M. You add an I if the cluster would break the phonotactic. So like, for example, with halhun here, you can't have MLH. You can only have two consonants next to each other in the middle of a word. So you need that I to separate it out. Same thing happens here with mokku. Mokku, you can't have an M and then two Ks, so you need the I there. But in these examples, you don't need the I, because it would just be two consonants, or in this case, one consonant. The other one where it goes, as you can see, it's after the first vowel is where that goes. That's what the V1 there is. This vialis is a suffix that reduplicates the final consonant after the letter U. So you add the letter U and then put the final consonant. Or if it ends with a vowel, which most words actually do, you just put the letter H and then another U, because there is no consonant to reduplicate. But when you do have a consonant with halhun, you have then U and then put another N. With add, you put U and then another R. With tick-on, again, it's add a U and then another N. So you just repeat the consonant that goes there. There are a couple other affixes for coordination. There's and, which you put on the second and later of a list. So it's blank and blank. Then you repeat the last vowel. The omega that I'm putting here, that just represents the last one, the subscript omega. So you repeat whatever the last vowel is, which there will be because every word needs at least one vowel. And then you add the letter L. And sometimes that can result in a double vowel, and that's fine. So like with samu, if you want to say like and cold, it would be samul, samul. If you want to say or, you repeat the last vowel and add pe, pe. So if you want to say or cold, you say samu, samuupe, samuupe. Or this would be like earupe. This would be tekanape. Oh, sorry, yeah, that would be earape, not earupe. A lot of these have U, I'm realizing. A lot of these have U as their last consonant, but they're not. That's just a coincidence. So these three particles, just to go over that one more time, the direct, which is nothing, is whatever the subject is, which will be indicated by the voice. The indirect case is either the doer it's either the object if it's agent case. It will be the doer, the agent, if it's patientive case. And then it will be either the doer or the patient in one of these two cases. And you just use context to figure out which it is in that case. I think I might do an order thing where it goes agent then patient. Since agent is the default voice, I might go, if you have like in agent, in patient, that's the order, the typical order. But I'm not sure about that yet. The last thing I'm going to talk about is the noun morphology. So the cases are indicated with those case particles that come before the noun when you're using these words as nouns. But there are also different kinds of suffixes you can add to nouns. There are also some prefixes, but I'm going to talk about suffixes first. The suffixes, so for absolute, I just put the kinds of endings that words can just default have. So absolute just means like what is the main form of the word when it's just acting as itself when you're using it typically. And these are the kinds of endings you can have. You'll remember maybe that in the phonology there are more possible clusters at the end, but that is only to account for these construct clusters that we end up with. That's not the norm. So really you can only end a word with a resonant because then it can take these suffixes that then add the plosive, the D, T, or S that you can also add after a resonant. Or it ends with a vowel. So these are the possible things a dictionary item can end with. Now, if you want to show that the thing is indeterminate, so it's sort of like an existential indefinite, like if you want to say like any of the word you're saying, like any or some or every or something like that, or not every, sorry, I think I might add an ending for that. You add an N to a word that ends with a vowel, or you add these, you vary the word to have this form at the end, which you're adding an A after making it some kind of cluster. My idea was that you're actually kind of adding a, what's the word? My idea is that you're adding N to all of these, really, and it's just assimilating or causing some kind of like more easy to pronounce cluster. And there's a little bit of like weird metathesis stuff going on with here, where it's like a RN becomes an RD becomes a DR. Associative is to be used when you're saying that thing and associated things, so and others. It's sort of like an etc. like word, etc., noun, etc., or verb, etc. If something is acting as that niche, for example, and then you want to say and others, you can do that as well. And this is sort of like an a suffix. I just put an I after a verb because I can kind of function as a semi-vowel there. But here it's reduplication plus a for the associative. Then I have construct or relational. So the construct form is used when you're going to modify the noun with another noun or verb with a noun, basically to have some kind of adjective after it or other kind of modifier after it. You use the construct state. You can also use it without a modifier after it to show a relational, like to say that it is someone or something's that. Like, let's say you use the word for I don't know. You can use the word for carnivore. If you want to say someone's carnivore or one's carnivore, then you can use the construct form without a modifier after it. And you'll know that you have a modifier after it or not because the modifier will then have a prefix. This is the usual form you'll see, but there's also something called the ornate pausal, and the idea of that is that if you end with a construct, which will be relational if you don't have something else after it, then you can sort of augment it with this extra ending because you might want a vowel at the end of your statement. If this is like the end of a sentence or a statement, you can embellish it for aesthetic purposes, but it doesn't have any difference in meaning. Other than, I guess, emphasizing that you're ending with a relational because there's no modifier after it. Now, the modifiers come in different flavors that are all kind of genitive in nature. I might add more modifiers that are not genitive in nature, but you basically have 5. Each one corresponds to one of the vowels, and then there's an epenthetic H if the word starts with a vowel. So vowel before the beginning of your word. And these are the different kinds of sort of modifiers that you can have. You can have an attributive, possessive, ablative, ornative, or partitive. And I'll explain those each very quickly. The attributive just relates the modifier to the head. So you're kind of just straight up using that second word as an adjective that says that it is as if, it is like, or as, or the same as, or identified with the second word, the modifier. So for example, if you want to say like the hot desert, for example, you use desert, and then you use attributive, and then you'd use the word for heat. So it's like heat is, or like hotness, the desert which is being described as hot. Then you can have possessive. So that's kind of straightforward. It's like of that thing. So the modifier is the possessor of the head. Then there's the ablative, which is saying that something is from or has its origin of or makeup from the modifier. So if you want to say like the omnivore from a certain biome, then you'd say omnivore in the construct state, and then ablative, and then the biome that they're from. Then there's ornative, which is having or containing that thing. So if you wanted to say, like a plant which has soluble fiber, you would say like the name of the plant and then oo, and then the word for soluble fiber. Then partitive is sort of like it's some of that thing. So, or like, instead of like coming from, it's like being a member of that thing or a piece of. So you could say like, I guess like you could use like a mineral word and then say it comes from an igneous rock is like what it's of. Instead of saying that it's from the igneous rock, you could say like a part of as in it is within it. In a sense, these are kind of like opposite relations to each other, the ornative and the partitive. It's like the head contains the modifier, and here the head is part of the modifier. So those are the relations that I have, and I'm just kind of calling them all genitive, but there's no real point. These are just all modifiers. And that is what I figured out of my grammar. We have run out of time to actually work on any more of the grammar. I've actually gone way past the time that I had planned to for today. But that is the overview of what I have decided so far. I think next conlang with me, I will show me working some more on other kinds of relations, because there are other kinds of semantic relations I really haven't cemented down yet that I want some way to more clearly express, because what I currently have are those 3 case particles for direct, indirect, and oblique. But there are a lot of different things that could be oblique, and I might want words to specify those. So maybe like you could add something onto the oblique to specify a more specific semantic relation. But I am not sure yet. I need to think through that more. I also need to add more process words so that it's easier to do some verbs, and some more occupation and other sort of more human-oriented things that will be useful. Because there isn't really a word for person or human, because personhood is a complicated thing that I think expressing very one-to-one from the way that most human languages do would kind of go against the goal of the language. I kind of want to treat every participant in an environment like it is on equal footing in some sense. But I might end up having a lot of different like social role words that I want to get across, more so than the niches. The niches are more like role in the ecology, like whether something is like a producer or a consumer. Like there's different kinds of like omnivores, carnivores, there's the autotrophs, and there's the recyclers, and those different sort of ecological roles. But I might also have sort of more intersocial roles, like roles people can have in a social dynamic, or animals could have in a social dynamic, or like plants can have in a plant sort of colony context or something. I kind of want to make that more robust, and also I want them to not be too specific to limited use with one type of creature. Like I want to tweak, for example, there is a word for scribe that I was like excited to have a word for, but the more I think about it, and this is something I didn't want to talk about before we end, is I want to make this wider so that it doesn't have to just be used for people. So I would want to actually expand this definition to fit the goal of the language better. So I might have to think of other things that could fit this word that aren't a human scholar. My first thought is something that keeps a record, anything that keeps some kind of record. So like if it's a person, it's sort of like a scribe or a scholar. But this could also be like the ring of a tree, like the rings of a tree, or it could be, I don't know, layers of sediment, something that keeps record of, I don't know, knowledge, information, maybe like DNA could be referred to with this, potentially modified with something to indicate like what kind of creature or thing is taking this role. So this would be more like a role, but then when it's a person, then they'd be a scholar, is sort of the idea. I want this to be way more vague, very, again, like Tokipona brained about how vague these words are going to be, but more with the goal of them being applicable to different things in the environment than just people. So that's something I want to work on for next time. So next time we have a conlang with me, that will be what I'm working on with this language. Next week should be a journal video. We're going to do some journal stuff next Friday. And then the following week will be another Yesterlore. So we're going to do, I think the next one that we're going to do is the, I can't remember if it's the Wife's Lament next, or if we're doing a riddle. It's one of those two. I think it's the Wife's Lament coming up next week. Not next week. In 2 weeks. So it should go journal with me next week. And then the Wife's Lament. And then probably another conlang with me after that. All right. So thank you, everyone who was involved in the chat today, and for viewing my conlang. I guess it's not exactly a showcase. It kind of came out to be a conlang showcase, even though that wasn't the exact goal. But thank you. And I hope this was interesting, at least, or gave you some inspiration if you're working on a conlang. And I hope I did an okay job explaining symmetrical voice. It has a few more complications I didn't get into, but that's sort of the gist of how it's going to work, at least in my language. But I hope that was helpful. I hope the formatting was okay. And I hope to see you in future Conlang with Me streams. And if you're interested in bullet journaling, next Friday we'll be doing more journaling. So thank you, and have a great rest of whatever time zone you are in. Farewell.